All right. Welcome everyone to our second class on this kind of little mini course on the healing power of forgiveness. Let's go ahead and start with a few prayers as we usually do. And Jana will be so kind as to lead us in these. Let me make sure she can see them. So we'll move some things out of the way. There we go. Oh, yes, I should wear my headset. Sorry. Forgot about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Janet, for bringing up to this information.
He didn't look the same without.
Yeah. Test, test. There we go. Okay.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times in English. To
To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower,
of the world,
supreme guide of
of
human beings,
human beings to be tamed,
teacher of gods, and
and human beings.
to you,
He
the
is a
completely
completely
and
and
fully
fully
awakened,
awakened God,
the endowed,
God,
transcendent
transcendent
destroyer,
destroyer,
the
the
glorious
glorious
conqueror,
conqueror,
the
the
subduer from
subduer
the
from the
Shakya
Shaka
clan,
clan. I
prostrate,
prostrate,
make
make
offerings,
offerings,
and
and
go
go for refuge.
Short mandala offering, once in Tibetan. Saj
Daji,
mi ju
Chukching me Trama Rira Chi Ni De Gyan Adi Sangye Jin Me Te Uwari Dokunam Dakshin Choparsho Idam Guru Ratna Mandalatam Niryatayami. Okay.
Refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I
Go for refuge until I am attained to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye
Chodan Chokyi Chognama, Janchu Bardu Dakni Katsuchi, Daki Chonyen Kepe Sonamki, Rola Penchir Sangye Druparsho, Sangye Chodan Chokyi Chognama, Janchu Bardu Dakni Katsuchi, Daki Chonyen Kepe Sonamki, Rola Pincher Sangye Drupardo. Okay, good. Thank you, Jana, for leading the prayers. Let's do a short meditation before we begin the lecture tonight. So just spend the first few minutes as usual focusing on the breath, just to calm the mind a bit, let go of distractions we might have from our day, things that we might have as preoccupations, worries, what have you. So just use the breath in whatever way that you tend to. If you have a particular technique you use with the breath, that's great. If not, I might suggest tuning into the sensation around the nostrils. Feel that very subtle sensation of the air going in and out of the nostrils, and just making that your focal point. And as usual, whenever you see that the mind has wandered away from that, then you let go of that and bring the mind back to the breath. So try not to, yeah, be distracted too much, but don't worry. If you do get distracted, that's just the nature of our minds. So we're going to do this in silence for a few minutes. I'll ring the little bell here to begin the meditation, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight's class. Now let's turn our attention towards our motivation for being here. And our motivation is important because what we bring into this time together that we have is what we get out of it, the results that we aspire to achieve. Everything we do becomes a cause for those results. So, to set our motivation for tonight, I thought we could briefly review how forgiveness is grounded in the Buddhist teachings and kind of is informed by various elements of our practice. The very first one we looked at last week was the idea of karma and interdependence. when we are in this world interacting with other beings, it's inevitable that we will do things that harm them or that they will harm us through their actions. And it's important that we have a way of working with those karmic connections, finding a way to navigate through life so that we don't create harmful patterns that will end up causing us and others future suffering. And it's because we're in a world of interdependence. It's impossible to live your life completely isolated from all beings. Again, it's inevitable that we will have occasions in our life where we need to forgive another, or we need to forgive ourselves. So we might bring that as an initial motivation for being here, to be able to work with forgiveness in the context of karma, to be able to learn more about this pattern that we can create of forgiving ourselves and others as a way of addressing the karma that we and others create with each other in this world of interdependence. But then a second element of the Buddha's teachings that we can bring to mind and feed into our motivation is to also lessen the amount of anger and frustration that we have with ourselves or with others. As we know, anger is one of the mental poisons, one of the states of mind that creates suffering for ourselves and can often create suffering for others as well. If we don't learn ways to skillfully manage our own anger, then we will have those, thoughts circulating, carry them around. Remember the idea of anger being like holding on to a red hot coal, waiting to throw it at the person who offended you. In the process of doing this, you're getting burned. You're suffering because you're holding on to that pattern of anger. So think about this as a motivation for being here as well. To find a skillful way to work with your own patterns of anger or resentment towards others who have harmed you. And to do this for yourself, to be able to be free of that pattern, to not hold on to thoughts of anger. And then the final topic we looked at that we can see as a context for our practice of forgiveness is one that we definitely can feed into our motivation for tonight. And this is the idea of having compassion for others as well as compassion for ourselves. Because every one of us is under the control of our karma, our delusions, because it's inevitable that we will have faults in relation to each other. We have to look upon each other with compassion. And compassion is the mind that sees that beings are suffering due to these factors and creating the causes for their own suffering through following thoughts of anger and not forgiving and so on. So these are faults that we all have. And is it possible to generate a mind that embraces others and ourselves with the wish that we be free of those faults and free of the suffering that comes from those faults? To learn to replace patterns of hatred or animosity, anger, with patterns of loving kindness and compassion and forgiveness. So we channel that into our motivation for being here with compassion for ourselves initially, wanting ourselves to be free of the entanglements of karma with each other, to be free of our own anger, hatred, and so on. But also to once and for all be free from all the causes of our suffering, our dissatisfaction. And then to generate that same wish for others. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the time we spend here together tonight became the cause for all beings to be free from all dissatisfaction, all difficulty, all pain, all suffering, and to find true peace and happiness. And think that it's for this reason that we've gathered here, to work on ourselves and develop our own abilities with the intention of being able to help all other beings to find the peace that they seek. So how is the light in here? Is it okay for folks? Because I know there's a few handouts. I don't know if everyone got a copy of the handouts. If you got them in the email, they're the same ones in the email. I think there's one that maybe we'll make sure we have for next week. But the main thing that we're using for this is a little structure on forgiveness that comes from Jack Kornfield. Jack Kornfield, as many of you know, he's a great practitioner and teacher in the Vipassana tradition, runs a center, Spirit Rock Center in the Bay Area. And so, again, the format that he's using for looking at forgiveness is to see it in terms of three levels of forgiveness practice. So I'll put it on the screen to remind us all of kind of where we were in terms of this, what we looked at last week. Last week, we began by talking about the nature of forgiveness. I mean, what does it mean to forgive? Which is, again, pretty common in a secular context as well as in a Buddhist context, kind of letting go of past harms that we've experienced or that we have done ourselves and so on, so that we want to not hold on to those things, carry those things forward. It's mainly, again, a practice of healing, of trying to heal ourselves and also to heal our relationships with others. The rationale in Buddhism for practicing forgiveness, we also touched on, and that was the 3 points that I raised in the meditation tonight. That we see that forgiveness can be couched within an understanding of karma and interdependence, an understanding of the faults of anger and how anger can be, very destructive to ourselves and, of course, continue to be destructive to others. And then thirdly, how compassion is a much more appropriate response. If we understand the fundamental situation that all beings are in, being under the control of these factors that, according to Buddha, have been there since beginningless time, well, we should be expecting that people are going to step on each other's toes and that our toes are going to be stepped on and so on. It's just natural, and this is a part of our world. Yes, we want to move away from that harm, and we would like others to move away from that harm, but we can have an understanding and a stance of compassion towards others. So those are the things we looked at last week. And we began to look and mainly, finished our looking at generating forgiveness for ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because there were a few points that I didn't have time to address last Thursday. The second part of the practice of forgiveness that Jack Kornfield put together is asking forgiveness of others and apologizing. So the first two are really about the faults that we have done. And this is Jack Kornfield and many other people who teach on forgiveness encourage us to start with ourselves, to really practice forgiveness for our own patterns of destructive behavior that we feel bad about, that we have some regret or remorse for, and to work with those skillfully rather than having patterns of guilt and so on, to try to find a way to extend forgiveness to ourselves in a compassionate way. So the second one that we're going to look at in a short while tonight is asking forgiveness of others when we have harmed them. And again, as it's being presented in the sheet that you have, the meditation, it's purely just you sitting on a cushion and practicing it. It's not necessarily the other person in front of you and apologizing to them, but if that can be arranged and can happen, there's obviously another level of healing that goes on, hopefully, if that happens, though not all situations have that opportunity, nor are they necessarily ideal for that type of interaction. So we're going to look at that a little bit tonight. So in terms of these three, as I said, we just started with this idea of extending forgiveness towards ourselves. The other sheet that we don't have a copy here tonight, but it's essentially some notes I put together on this meditation, because the meditation is fairly sparse. These are the notes I put together for generating forgiveness for ourselves. Again, self-forgiveness means seeing our faults clearly, taking responsibility for them with remorse and making amends, and then coming to peace about them. This is Rick Hanson's description of what he means by self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness is very close to self-compassion, right? Many of you probably do a meditation, a practice around self-compassion, where we acknowledge our suffering, our faults, and we extend a compassionate stance towards ourselves, understanding again that we're not perfect, that we will make mistakes and step on other people's toes. And we need to forgive ourselves, as Jack Kornfield says here. It's one of our most essential tasks. Just as others have been caught in suffering, so have we. If we look honestly at our life, we can see the sorrows and pain that have led to our own wrongdoing. In this, we can finally extend forgiveness to ourselves. We can hold the pain we have caused in compassion. Without such mercy, we will live our own life in exile. So again, the practice itself of forgiving ourselves is set out on this sheet and in the slides that I showed you last week, begins by recalling the ways through our body, our physical actions, our speech, our thoughts. Speech is one of the main ways I think that we do injure each other, and that we have probably been guilty of not being as skillful in our speech with other beings. But we think about any of these actions and again, generate a feeling of remorse or regret. It's not guilt. It's not feeling like you're a horrible person because you did these things. That's the mind of guilt. In fact, I find it quite interesting. In the Tibetan language, there is no word for guilt. I mean, they didn't grow up with that thought. This is a constructed thought that we have in our culture that we teach from a very young age, right? You're not born feeling guilty, but you learn to feel guilty pretty quickly. As soon as you do something wrong, and then your parents wag their finger at you, and you feel bad about yourself. Feeling bad about what you did is remorse or regret. Feeling bad about yourself because you did it is guilt. That's the differentiation. So guilt doesn't get you anywhere. Guilt just is self-flagellation. It's not really, a healthy mind to have. So again, begin self-forgiveness with less significant things, work up to those that are heavier. As you're doing this, appreciate your good qualities, especially your willingness to work with your own faults in this way. Give yourself credit. You're actually going to look at your faults, admit to them and to yourself, and work on forgiving yourself for those. Acknowledge the ways that you've already learned how to grow from these experiences. You learn from them. Observe whatever feeling of forgiveness that arises, even if it's minimal. Engage in the practice as best as you can. Again, we always say fake it until you make it, and that's perfectly fine. Initially, it might feel very awkward to, say phrases of forgiveness towards ourselves, but over time, it should feel more authentic. And then conclude by reflecting on your own values and aspirations that you want to honor and uphold in the future, and establish a strong intention to continue in that direction. So again, I'm just reviewing this. You're going to see it again. There's similar patterns for asking forgiveness of others as well as eventually forgiving others, which we're going to talk about next week. But this is the meditation at the top of the screen there. That's a very brief meditation that Jack Kornfield put together. That's why I put these notes together, was to maybe give a little more information behind the scenes. And again, I won't read of all of what he has there, but you'll see at the end of each of these in italics are these affirmations that we make towards ourselves, that we think about in regard to a situation and what have you. So these may be a way that you're comfortable wording these thoughts, like it says there, for the ways I have, maybe I'll make this a little bit larger in the Gompa here. So can see, that's maybe too much, but let's see. Too much that way. Let me try the other way. There, okay. For the ways I have hurt myself through action or inaction out of fear, pain, and confusion, I now extend a full and heartfelt forgiveness. I forgive myself. I forgive myself. Again, find words that work for you. You don't have to use those particular words, but just feel like you're doing something very nurturing. I know when Kristen Neff, many of you have heard of Kristen Neff, she's a researcher into self-compassion. She has a little practice she calls a self-compassion break. And the third part of it, where you're actually extending compassion to yourself with these types of affirmations, she encourages you to maybe put your hand on your heart, or to do an embrace even of yourself, to hug yourself, something that feels nurturing for you. Because again, this first level of the practice is really about feeling like we're being embraced and held in thoughts of forgiveness. Yes, we're the one extending them to ourselves. So it's a bit of a closed circuit, but nonetheless, it's how we begin our practice of becoming familiar with that, being able to extend forgiveness initially towards ourselves. Now, we've all forgiven other people. I'm not denying that we have some experience around forgiveness. But hopefully through these 3 sessions, we're able to gain a little bit more kind of heartfelt practice of compassion, where we're really doing it with a lot of thoughts behind it, a lot of information. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight even about apologizing, because that's a portion of what we're going to look at in terms of seeking forgiveness of others. We're never taught how to apologize. I mean, at a very young age, we're told, say you're sorry, say you're sorry, but you could just go, I'm sorry. I mean, is that an apology? We'll talk about that. I think it's very lacking because we need to have a lot more content for an apology to really be a true apology. Again, so these are the sorts of things, again, that we're trying to become familiar with. So in this very first step, it's really about extending that forgiving thought towards ourselves to realize that we are as deserving of forgiveness as any other being. I think there's one quote from the Buddha where he says, you can search the whole universe and beyond, and you're not going to ever find anyone who is more deserving of forgiveness than yourself. Or he says, he doesn't use forgiveness, he uses the idea of compassion, love, what have you. Now, he's not saying that you should think you're the center of the universe and you're more important than everybody else. He's saying you can't find anyone who's more deserving than you, because we're all equally deserving. Everyone deserves compassion, no matter what they have done. We'll talk about that, next week when we go into forgiveness for others. We can find a way to extend forgiveness to others, even if it's just in our own heart. Find a way to hold that stance. But nonetheless, this is where it starts, is really practicing it towards ourselves. Let me go through a little bit more on this idea of self-forgiveness before we move on to the next part. Why is it so hard to forgive ourselves? I don't know, are there any thoughts on that anyone would like to share before I give you my thoughts on that? I mean, in our culture, yeah, Anne Marie, please.
Basically, I know where I make mistakes,
Uh-huh.
and I do it all the time,
Yeah.
and it's hard to forgive.
Yeah, I think again, there's certainly some thoughts that inform that as well. Why we do tend to beat ourselves up a lot. Our culture has a very serious epidemic of self-hatred, self-deprecation, self-loathing, even these kinds of thoughts. It's not, again, so common in some of these Eastern cultures. Here, too, there's a story where Sharon Salzberg and a number of other Buddhist practitioners, I think in somewhere in like the early 90s, not too long after His Holiness had started meeting with Westerners on a more frequent basis. They're all, in an audience with His Holiness, and Sharon Salzberg says, Your Holiness, I'd really like to get your advice about how to deal with students that we have who have self-hatred. And His Holiness goes, what are you talking about? Self-hatred. In Tibetan Buddhism, we often talk about self-cherishing and this over self-centeredness that we have, where we treat ourselves extra special, and that we have to overcome that thought so we can be focused on the welfare of others. And this idea of hating oneself, loathing oneself, is something that's really foreign to these cultures. They don't see that. That's not, again, this is a construction we have in our culture to a greater degree now. In our modern age, where things are so assimilated into different cultures, maybe it's happening at a greater level in other cultures as well. But in the West, we get really good at this, right? Putting ourselves down. The moment we see a fault in ourselves, we beat ourselves up, and it's just ridiculous. That's that mind of guilt again, that thinks of ourselves as being less than, being awful, being bad, because we do things that are understandable. When we're all under the control of our delusions, the Buddha says. So it's understandable that we're going to step in it every now and then, right? But I think there's an extra layer to this. Let me put on the screen some thoughts that I think are also informing our tendency to find it hard to forgive ourselves. This is from Ratnagosha, who is a Friends of the Western Buddhist Order teacher. I think that's still their name. You were involved with them, Sarah, weren't you? Friends of the Western Buddhist Order? Can't remember. Yes, maybe? You were. Yeah. Some people give themselves a hard time, he says. The reason they give themselves a hard time seems to be because they are not perfect. But where did they get the idea that they should be perfect? We have this in our culture, right? You grow up almost wanting, your parents want you to be perfect, be the best behaved child, always get good grades, always do the right thing. Well, it's perhaps not as absurd as it sounds. People who have genuine spiritual aspirations are often very idealistic. I mean, that this even plays out in our spiritual path, right? This means that they have high standards. In fact, their standards are at the level of their highest ideals. We do tend to take those same patterns we've learned as young children and apply them in a spiritual path in the same way. Oh, I'm not a good Buddhist if I'm not 100% Buddhist all the time, saying all the right things, doing all the right things. It's crazy, right? This is as it should be. I mean, we should have good ideals. However, a confusion sometimes occurs so that we expect the real day-to-day situation to measure up to the ideal. And we are inevitably disappointed, right? Because we can't live up to that ideal yet. We're working towards that ideal. That's the goal that we have. And it's good to have that as a thought, as something to guide us. So Ratnaghosh concludes, he says, we need to forgive ourselves for not living up to our ideals all the time, while at the same time striving to live up to our ideals. It's a bit of a paradox, but this is what we do. We don't beat ourselves up because we're not there, but we keep moving towards where we want to be. And just recognize that this is the play of spiritual practice. And we, again, don't fall into the extremes of beating ourselves up or not having any ideals at all and just living our lives without that. Let me just finish this sentence here and then I'll take it off screen and we'll see what Anne-Marie wants to share. Ideals are something to reach for, something to look up to, not something to beat ourselves up with. All right. Yes, Anne-Marie.
Well, I was just reflecting on, I grew up in the Catholic faith, and
Mhm.
during the mass, there's a part where, you're honoring Jesus and his sacrifice. And
Mm.
you go, hit your breast, it's my fault, it's my fault, it's my most grievous fault. And they do that every day.
Yeah.
So no wonder we feel guilty.
And again, we're in no way ever kind of saying that we shouldn't have bad feelings about the things that we did. We just shouldn't be layering that with extra stuff. It is good to have, I mean, otherwise, if we go about our lives with no conscience, which some people do, right? And maybe we think of some people in this country right now not having a whole lot of conscience that's guiding their actions and behavior. But if you do that, well, then again, you're not attending to the very basic principles of good morality that are the foundation of Buddhist practice, but they're the foundation of almost every spiritual practice. Every spiritual tradition has its own way of approaching morality. Sometimes that morality can look a little different here and there in regard to that tradition. But morality is a good way to, kind of attend to our presence in the world and how we want to be with others, right? And in Buddhism, of course, that's couched in karma. We don't want to get into patterns where we are harming others because, in effect, we are harming ourselves as well. So again, we have to have some conscience. We have to have some attention to our actions, some discipline. I often talk about this phrase that Cheryl Huber used. She's a Zen teacher. She uses the phrase compassionate self-discipline. We do need to tend to our own spiritual path and make sure that we continue to improve over time. But we're going to have ups and downs in that. Our path is going to be kind of all over the place, but with a general upward trajectory, hopefully. We don't beat ourselves up if we have failures every now and then. We just recognize that that's part of the process. And we often learn from our failures or disappointments, right? And I don't even like to call them failures necessarily, because when we do things that are against the grain of how we would like to live, our ideals, we can often learn a lot from those, right? Wow, how did I go there? How did that happen? We can meditate on it, reflect on it, and change our thoughts and our behavior. If we don't ever do anything astray, well, then I think we're pretty lucky. Maybe we're not paying attention, but the idea is whenever we do have those occasions, those are learning opportunities as well. So this path that Ratnaghosh is speaking about, that we get an ideal of where we want to be spiritually, and nothing wrong with that, right? Again, good to have those ideals, good to be striving for those. But because we're not there yet, we need self-forgiveness. We need to be able to say to ourselves, yes, you did these things out of your own crazy, deluded mind, your tendency to be greedy or angry or whatever the case might be. And that's the nature of things. It's not something that we can change at the moment, but we can strive to move in that direction. Because we see in our teachers. I mean, look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've never seen him be angry at what happened, for example, with the Tibetan people due to the Chinese. He talks about how he's had moments of anger, but I tend to think that they're not quite as serious as the anger I have in my mind, per se. But we see that it's possible to move in that direction because our teachers do it. Great practitioners do that. It's just a matter of putting our effort into it. But self-forgiveness helps. It helps us to not be so focused on those downfalls and identify with those. Think, oh, I'm a lousy practitioner. Oh, I can't really do what Buddhism is requiring me to do. I just have to throw in the towel or whatever. It's okay. We're all on our own trajectory, and we all come into this life with different patterns and different dispositions. So be kind to yourself, and forgiveness is one of the ways that we do that. So I want to just touch on one other thing that has to do with our Buddhist practice is forgiving ourselves enough to counteract our negative actions. So if you do a practice of forgiveness at the end of every day, which I think is nice, right? Because we are going to step on certain people or beings' toes throughout almost every day, maybe in little ways, small ways. Hopefully, we're not doing really huge things, but when we do even the huge things, it's good to have some dedicated time where we practice self-forgiveness. But is that enough to kind of clear up the karma? Of course, in our tradition, we would say no. There's a purification practice that we should ideally be doing in conjunction with self-forgiveness. At the end of every day, we should do something that helps us to tidy up our mess. Ken McLeod, who I mentioned in last week's class, in one article that he did for Tricycle Magazine, Forgiveness is Not Buddhist. I shared a little bit about his thoughts on that last week. But this is one of his reasons why he thinks forgiveness doesn't really fit as much into a Buddhist structure, is because the main tool for working with the negative actions that we've done is purification of our karma. So he says here, one of the central principles of karma is that no one can intervene in the way my actions evolve in me, not even a Buddha. And this is something we would all hold to, right? I mean, no one else can purify your karma for you. If the Buddhists could do it, they would have done it already, right? They would have said, there, you don't have to suffer anymore from all the horrible negative things that you've done, right? It's a law of cause and effect, that we have to experience the results of the actions we have done unless we have purified them. And of course, in regard to the positive actions, we don't want to do anything to harm that karma that could ripen into good experiences. But as he says there, that last sentence, only I can do something about that through purification practice or other means. So the four opponent powers that we use in this tradition for purification, actually, you were talking about the Catholic Church. I grew up Catholic as well, Anne Marie. These I can pattern them to what I would have in a Catholic act of confession, which I would do. You'd go and see the priest and you'd kneel down and you'd say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was da 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 da," And then you would go through all the various actions that you had that you regret. I regret that I stole a gumball from, my brother, or, whatever, the silly things that you would be confessing as 5, 6-year-old, whatever. Again, regret is an important part of taking ownership of that. We say, yes, I did this. Not, I feel guilty about it and I'm a horrible person because of it. It's just saying, I take responsibility. I did lie to that person. I did steal from that person, whatever the case might be. Reliance in the confessional, that's like relying upon the priests and as an agent of God and Jesus to help you to purify those faults through your own confession. Here we rely upon our refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, restoring that sense of safe direction we find, especially in the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, as well as in this Mahayana tradition, generating bodhicitta. I might talk about these really briefly. If we say in general, as I was saying just a short while ago, we have a foundation of morality that is really the basis of our practice. Well, that morality is not determined by the Buddha, right? It's not something the Buddha said, oh, this is good and this is bad. It's not like a theistic tradition where you're created by God and therefore you have to follow God's rules. You're not created by the Buddha. You're a creation of your own karma and all the various other things that fed into your being here. But you have kind of need the information from the Buddha about what to engage in and what not to engage in. The Buddha is an agent of information, of understanding, not someone saying you should do this and you shouldn't do that. So when you hear teachings about karma in Buddhism, we take them as guidelines, instructions for how to live a good life, how to have a foundation of morality. So when we restore our sense of refuge in the three jewels, especially in the Dharma, we're primarily saying, I'm reaffirming my conviction in karma, that I need to avoid these types of behaviors, or I'm going to be the one bearing the suffering of those actions. I have to experience the results. So that's the understanding we want to have when we restore our refuge. Bodhicitta, this mind that wants to benefit all beings to the greatest degree by becoming a Buddha ourselves, is a way of kind of healing over the ways that we've harmed other beings. Invariably, everything we are purifying, or most of what we're purifying, are things that have harmed others as well. Well, if now I generate a mind that wants to benefit those beings and not harm them, it's already a very powerful opponent force. Remember, these are called the four opponent factors because they all have some power to oppose the actions that we've done. The regret is a powerful statement of, yes, I regret that I did these things. Under the control of my crazy mind, I stepped in it again. Secondly, we have that reliance that I'm talking about, which restores my refuge and generates this mind of compassion and love for all beings. I'm already beginning to repair my relationship with the Dharma, my relationship with other beings. They all make a step in that direction. The third one is the actual remedy. I don't need to put it on the screen. I do have a note on the screen, though, that can include apologizing, which I'll talk about in this second type of the second part of the meditation that I'll go into shortly. But remedy means you have to do some sort of positive karma that acts as a counterforce to the negative karma that you've created. Now, in this tradition, we use things like Vajrasattva mantra or prostrations to the 35 Buddhas, but you can do any virtuous act. You can sit down and read the Heart Sutra, or you can sit down and just reflect on compassion for beings. You can do whatever feels like a very positive action to engage in that acts as that counterforce. But it has to have kind of some substance to it, and you have to be thinking, well, this is how I am kind of these negative actions, I'm kind of putting that on there as a way of covering them and keeping them from maturing and ripening into their results. The remedy acts as the actual antidote, but everything else contributes to the power of that remedy through having strong regret, through having good reliance, and then engaging in the actual remedy. The fourth of these opponent powers, they all have this, in this presentation, they all start with R, so it becomes a device to remember the names of them. The last one is some level of resolve that you're not going to engage in these behaviors again. That goes back to we have these ideals, right, that we want to aim for. Well, we're never going to get to the ideals if we just keep doing the same thing again and again and again. So make a resolve to refrain from those actions as best as you can. You know, I remember at the end of the confession, going back to the Catholic confession, I think the priest says, you know, you are absolved of your sins. Now go forth and do not sin again. I mean, as a young kid, you hear that, you go, oh my gosh, how am I going to do that? You know, never sin again. You know, we are going to do these things again. And sometimes we need a little more lenience then. So maybe you have a pattern of, you know, telling white lies or something, and you know that you're going to tell them again. Well, there's no point at this point of the purification to say, I will never tell a white lie again, right? Because you know you have a tendency to do that. So you're going to say, okay, for the next hour, for the next 5 minutes, for the next minute, whatever it is that you think you can adhere to, make that commitment and then gradually try to increase that. So you move in the direction of your ideals. That's the whole purpose of purification. Well, the main purpose is to stop you from experiencing the results that can be so difficult from the actions that we've done, but to really make progress forward through these 4 steps. They're very powerful steps. Again, there's many more teachings on these 4 that I could go into. This is a part of our teachings on karma, the Buddha's wonderful technique that he gave us for helping to tidy up our mess, like I said. Make sure that those karmic seeds don't continue to grow and develop into horrible results, but rather they are thwarted in that process. And often they don't even give rise to any results because we've done that effectively. But all 4 have to be in place. They do say that resolve is one of the most important. If we get to the end of it, we go, okay, I cleaned it up, but I can clean it up again tomorrow when I do the same things. Well, then do you move in any direction forward? No, you just keep doing the same things over and over again and continuing to clean it up, thinking that there's no problem with it. So let me stop it here. I think the next slide is getting into, asking forgiveness of others. This is our main topic for tonight. But any questions or comments on self-forgiveness and what we mean by that? Yes, please, Stella.
Don, where do you think that physical punishment came into it? Because you mentioned being raised Catholic, I was too,
Mm,
but even the nuns used to, you know, and our parents used to, you know, and thinking that punishment would keep us from repeating the behavior or whatever, or teach us a lesson or.
yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know for sure all of where all of these things come in, but they obviously do play a role in a lot of spiritual traditions in terms of the way people feel like they have to be punished for their sins, punished for their negative actions. But it plays out in our society, right? I mean, we have penal institutions, prisons and what have you, as places where people go with some level of punishment. I've done prison work where I've been, doing Buddhist teachings for prisoners. It came to a halt with the pandemic, and then when I tried to start it up again, the guys at the prison had all moved on to other locations, so it was impossible for me to reconnect with them in a way where I could visit them. But there was one time I was there for volunteer training, and the assistant warden said, "The men here are not here to be punished. Being here is their punishment." And I was like, I'm not sure I get the difference, but I think he was meaning that when they're there, they don't like mete out punishment to people, though I would guess that that probably does still happen. I'm sure that in the tension of being guards in the prison and then what prisoners might do, that you're going to have those interactions. But you are punished to some degree for the faults that you have, for the actions that you've done in our society. So it's been part of society for an awful long time, I think. Probably even the time of the Buddha, then in India, they would probably still do physical harm to people who had done things. In many cultures, they still do this, like chopping off people's arms when they've stolen things or, whatever the case might be. So I think it's just an extension of our delusions, right? Some ignorance that's operating that thinks that we have to stop people from doing these behaviors because they harm us, but we harm others in the process of doing that. Look at capital punishment that's still here for our nation and in a number of our states. We're lucky we don't have capital punishment in New Mexico, but that whole idea of like sanctioned harm to another being because of the harm they've done to someone else is a really horrible way to kind of deal with negative behavior, in my estimation. I know there are people who would disagree with me on that. I can hear those sorts of opinions and understand where that's coming from, especially people who have had harm inflicted upon them by others. But does it really solve the problem? No. So, yeah, I don't know where it comes from. I wish it would go away. I wish that beings would learn how to find more skillful ways to nurture people into good behavior, rather than punishing them when they don't.
Because your own karma really does the punishing, you're really.
Well, exactly. I mean, I was reading one article about like justice in Buddhism. I mean, is there such a thing as justice in Buddhism? We use the term justice in our society a lot, and it tends to mean having some sort of way of making good for a harm that has been done, right? That's the process. Well, you can do that. I mean, there's nothing wrong, I suppose, with having it in society, but karma takes care of itself. If there isn't a process for managing one's karma, no matter what happens in terms of justice, there's still that aspect of it. And again, that's a Buddhist perspective. I understand that everyone's not signing up for that idea. But yeah, Buddhism justice isn't really that seen as that much of a concept. Now, terms like social justice, where we are recognizing that there's a lot of unfair treatment of many people, marginalized people in our society, and so on, and we need to address that, that's an extension of our compassion, right? And sometimes that works. Sometimes you can have campaigns to help people that are disadvantaged to some degree and make it work. Other times it's impossible. We see how karma is playing out there too. Some things are very hard to address in our world. Change the karma of specific peoples or what have you. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of going off on that, but yeah, Anne Marie, were you going to say something? And
Yeah,
then-
I was gonna say, I guess I kind of disagree with you on, going to confession and getting forgiveness. I think the whole point going to confession is examining yourself and how
Mhm.
you want to be.
Sure.
And so when you
Right.
go and say, I did this, I lied or whatever, you're saying, I don't want to be like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I wasn't putting confession down. I was just saying that that sentence at the end, to go forth and not sin again, is a pretty tall order. Because again, who can make that commitment? I can't make the commitment at the end of my purification practice that I'm never going
I
to
don't
engage in
either.
these. Yeah. But no, I think it's a healthy practice.
Oh,
It's not really, it's closer, it's again, it's a more of a purification practice like we have in Buddhism than a practice of forgiveness. I think it's again, an interchange with the priest as an agent of God to absolve you of the negativities you've done by feeling bad about what you've done. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, please. What's your name, by the way?
Laurel,
Laurel?
yeah.
Yes, thanks, Laurel.
Love this talk, thank you.
Mhm.
Thinking about how the word sin,
Ah,
which means, it's an archery term in Aramaic, meaning kata. It means being off the mark, which is more of a mistake.
Right.
And somehow the church evolved into sin and sacrifice, and in the Western mind, there's a lot of, underpinning. I teach a course in miracles, and underpinning is kind of a way of correcting all that Christian torture, self-torture. Guilt is the underpinning, fear motivated thing that when that's resolved, and I've seen it in my own mind when it was resolved in a bigger way than I thought. My mind went singular and saw how I'm responsible for the world I see, and all I could do was feel sad. And my teacher said that guilt is more of the same thing. So in the Avengers knife, instead of out here and separation, when the separation ended, now I'm feeling at cause of sin. And yet, if there's no guilt, it ends at that point. I don't know if that makes sense. It was a quantum experience that I can't retract. I can't go back and project the same way I did before.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think we do that with making God have a special someone suffer and die for our sins. That whole idea of sacrifice seems to be really connected with the idea of sin and unforgiveness and being born with original sin and this whole kind of cloud of guilt.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing your experiences, Laurel. Yeah, again, I don't have an expertise around that whole side of it, of a theistic kind of approach to all of this. In Buddhism, of course, when there's no, again, creator God, there's no one pulling the strings or that you're kind of have an onus to because they have created you in this world. It all becomes your own stuff to work with. And so again, these mind states we look at as, are they beneficial to furthering my mental development, or are they opposed to me developing my mind further? So they're seen from that vantage point of, guilt maybe having a pattern that feeds more negative thought thinking and not really embracing. We use this concept of Buddha nature. We all have the potential, this kind of purity within ourselves to ripen that into this state of Buddhahood, to become just like the Buddha, to become this enlightened being. So there's this, kind of, it goes against the grain, these sorts of thoughts of what we're trying to accomplish. So it's a different perspective, but thank you for sharing that perspective. Yeah.
It's really at the core, they're not really different.
Yeah.
What I see is
Okay.
there's right action and knowing and compassion, and it naturally flows. Just taking the separate theistic side out is helpful in Christianity as well. So
Good.
it's a new trend.
Good. So again, I think these are all part and parcel of the same thing, and every tradition once more has its way of trying to approach that, how to be more whole and to heal oneself within the context of that particular orientation. So good. Let's carry on, or we're going to not get to tonight's topic as much as I'd like to. What is it about? About an hour in. So we'll see what I can do justice to this. I think it's not horribly complicated. We're talking about the similar process because we're still working once more in this second step with things that we have done. And the first step was forgiveness for ourselves. The next one is about how do we seek forgiveness of others? How do we make it the circle a bit more complete? Because again, generating forgiveness for yourself does, I don't remember what, I don't like the phrase let you off the hook. It does to some degree deal with the negativity that we've done to help release a lot of that and to heal from that. But it hasn't touched our relationship with the other person necessarily, right? Now, again, this is all still part of a meditation, as I pointed out earlier. It can evolve into doing something, if that's possible, with the person that you have offended, the person who was the object of your action. Let's go through some of the steps on this. What is the nature of asking forgiveness of others and why is it necessary? This is also on that other sheet, the notes sheet. I think there's one phrase about it, but I want to share from Gina Sharp. I did her little mini course that she had online around forgiveness because, as I mentioned last week, when I was first asked to teach about forgiveness, I didn't really have a good context for forgiveness in Buddhism because it's not taught so much. She says, our asking forgiveness from other beings is based not on shame or guilt or blame, but on our recognition of what has happened, the ways in which ignorance or unawareness has worked in our lives that has led to our actions, our thoughts, or our words being the cause of someone else's unhappiness, sorrow, suffering. And it's that recognition that we have become an agent of causing suffering and difficulty for others. And that's an acknowledgement, and it's a form of taking responsibility, again, for our role in being a human being interacting with others in this world, having that interdependent world that we are involved in. Noah Levine is has had some questions around his behavior. I'm pointing that out, some of you. He's a wonderful teacher, the things that I've seen from him. I like this quote from him. He says, asking forgiveness then is an act of humility, generosity, and healing. Some level of regret will remain and should, but once more, shame and guilt and these sorts of emotions will eventually disappear. Through structured meditation, we can train the heart and mind to let go, to meet past pains with understanding and acceptance. So we do see that again, this is a way of kind of working with that circle to say that, okay, I've given forgiveness to myself, extended it to myself because of what I've done that has been of harm to others. I need to be concerned about the beings that have been on the receiving end of that. So let's go through the meditation that works with this. Again, this is also on this sheet. I'll just show you on the sheet again. We have first this part of it, which we go through. Let's see if I can I move this guy over here? No, I don't think I can. Might have to get that over just a little bit. Too much. I think that's clip out. It's best I'm going to. The meditation itself is the following, but as I said, I've got some additional notes that I'll go through in a moment. This idea there are many ways I have hurt and harmed others, have betrayed or abandoned them, caused them suffering, knowingly or unknowingly, out of my pain, fear, anger, and confusion. Let yourself remember and visualize the ways you have hurt others. See and feel the pain you have caused out of your own fear and confusion. Feel your own sorrow and regret. Again, and I know that once you hear those words, you start thinking, oh, and I'm a horrible person. I feel guilty. Try to keep those thoughts out of it. It's just acknowledging, again, we're in this relationship with others where invariably we're going to cause harm at times. Sense that finally you can release this burden and ask for forgiveness. Picture each memory that still burdens your heart. And then to each person in your mind, repeat, I ask for your forgiveness. I ask for your forgiveness. You could use phrases like, please forgive me. Whatever works for you. Again, you can use the language that is appropriate. Now, to inform that with a few more thoughts, because that sounds fairly simple, and it can be fairly simple, but I think it's good to put a little more meat on the bones, if you will. So let's go through some of the slides where I've got some of the additional steps that are in my notes as well. First, to reflect on the ways that you feel you've not been forgiven fully for any of the three types of actions you've done that have harmed yourself, and particularly those which have also been harmful to others. I was talking to Anne Marie earlier about this process, this second step. You have to recognize that these have also harmed yourself. You already did the self-forgiveness, but it's still good to recall that, to say that these actions I've engaged in have also harmed me, have created karmic patterns that I will have to live with and I will have to experience the results of. But they have also been harmful to others. So that's the impetus. By recalling these three types of physical actions, verbal actions, or even the thoughts that we've had towards others. Sometimes they don't get to being verbalized or something acted out, but we have to still recall those. As with self-forgiveness, begin asking forgiveness with those things that are less significant, working up to heavier ones. And when I was doing some of this prison work, I was working in particular with one man who had taken the life of another man. It was a manslaughter charge. It wasn't a murder charge. That's why it's in the facility that I could go into at a lower level of security. But essentially, that's a big thing to work with, right? That you've taken the life of another human being. That's not necessarily where you want to start in forgiving yourself. Maybe forgive yourself for some smaller things and then work on that one. That's a big one that people probably need to work continually on, just like with purification. Bigger actions, more substantial actions do require a greater level of purification as well. The next bullet point, thinking about those people who have been the object of your actions, truly value those relationships and acknowledge their experience of hurt or pain that you caused. Kind of be mindful of that. That's part of this self-forgiveness as well. Forgiveness of others as well, is to recognize the pain or the suffering you've caused to others through your actions. Again, not to beat yourself up, but to recognize that's part of the equation. That's why we need to engage in this type of practice. As you do this practice that, set out in Jack Kornfield's meditation, be aware of how difficult it is to accept your own mistakes and to feel worthy of being forgiven for them by those you've offended. It is difficult to do that. We saw that with self-forgiveness. It's hard to face up to the things we've done. Take care, Stella. Enjoy your time with your son. Yeah, no problem. We'll see you next Thursday. Okay. Observe whatever releasing of the burden of those actions that occurs, the feelings in your heart, the thoughts in your mind, any sensations in your body. As I mentioned last week, although we don't talk often about the physical elements involved in forgiveness, and we mainly think of it as a mental process, we also hold a lot of things in our body in terms of the wounds we've experienced from others, the wounds we've inflicted on ourselves through our behavior that has not been on target, not hitting the mark. So the idea is that we need to recognize that some of this healing is going to happen in our bodies as well. It's psychosomatic. It's not just purely a mental process. We might notice some lightening within our body, some ease that we might feel as we engage in a process of seeking forgiveness of others. As I said before, engage in the practice as best as you can with whatever level of authenticity you have, fake it till you make it kind of idea. And as before, conclude by reflecting on your own values and aspirations that you want to honor and uphold in the future, establishing a strong intention to continue in that vein. So again, all of what I just went through now here is on that same sheet that, again, is being sent out kindly by Sarah in the weekly email. If you're not on the email list, then certainly you can talk to her about getting on that. But this is the same, again, kind of steps that are here in this portion of it, about how do you go about this process of asking forgiveness of others. Yes, I do have all of those quotes even on this sheet, so you don't necessarily need the slides. You will need the slides, though, for this next section. I'm going to kind of move away from seeking forgiveness of others to talk a little bit more about apologizing and the role that apologizing plays in this. I may have one other topic. Let me make sure before I go on to that. Oh, there it is. Yeah, apologizing. So let's stop here for just a second once more. Are there any questions on the actual practice that Jack Kornfield sets out or on those additional thoughts that I've shared?
Bob,
Yes, Anne-Marie.
I'm in a situation where somebody is accusing me of something that I never did, but they're certain that I did it. So I feel like I have to apologize, even though I never did it, because otherwise we'll never have a relationship. What do you think?
Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with taking the blame in a sense. Blame's not the greatest word to use here, but kind of when we get to these teachings that we use in Tibetan Buddhism often that we call Lojong, mind training, there's that wonderful verse from the 8 verses of mind training. It's the 5th verse where we say, when out of envy others mistreat me with insults, abuse, and the like, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to them, to others. that's a bit of that idea, right? I'm going to accept defeat. I'm going to say, okay, I'm the one who did this, and, kind of apologize to the other person as if we had actually done that action, even though we know 100% that we didn't do that action. This is a perception, again, that that other person is having. Now, again, I'm saying that in a general way. I think every situation we need to look at more closely. And so it would become very situational in terms of saying, is this a healthy way to have this relationship with this person? Because maybe this is a pattern that they act out often, where they're blaming everyone else for all the things that are wrong in their life and everything. And it might not be the most skillful way to work with them to begin to see some of that. If it's a one-time thing where it's like, okay, I really want my main goal is to have a good relationship with this person. And if I can take onus for this one time and apologize, even though I know I didn't do it, then I'm going to do that for the sake of having this good relationship. But there may be other times where I think it's not quite so helpful. There's a lot of hands up. Let's see what Sarah says first.
With that, because it's distorting truth. And I think we should always try to be, loyal to the truth of what is.
That's an interesting perspective. I'll tell more on that.
That wasn't about yourself. I mean, it's certainly admirable, but still, it distorts truth.
It's a lie.
But it's done with a motivation that is different. Remember, I didn't say you're lying because you want to lie. You're taking onus in that situation because you want a good relationship. There's a story of this teacher. I think it may have been, I don't think it was Geshe Langri but it was one of these Lojong masters where this woman came into the teaching. He's teaching all these monks or whatever. Woman came into the teaching with a baby. And she said, here's your baby, and hands it to this teacher. And the implication, of course, is that he had sex with the woman, broke his monastic vows, and that this is his offspring from this woman. And he accepted the baby and he says, okay, thank you for giving me my baby. And he took care of the baby. And then eventually the woman, out of her feelings of, remorse at what she had done, came and took the child. But he put forward what could be seen as a lie for the sake of not wanting this woman to feel ostracized and for her to help learn a lesson, to actually come to some understanding from it. These get into topics that, again, I'm not saying when I give you that answer that this is what the advice I would give everybody in the world at all times. I think everything is, again, situational, depending upon what has happened, who the other person is, where you are at in your own perspective of all of this. But the Lojong teachings are often about acknowledging that sometimes the best thing to do is to go forward with something that will help the situation to move in a different direction. Yeah.
I like to think of it as letting someone be right too, because a lot of times argumentatively, we might know the truth, but it's not the issue, so you give into the situation.
Ajahn Brahm, I don't know if you know of Ajahn Brahm. He's this wonderful teacher in the Vipassana, Theravadan tradition, like the Thai forest monks and what have you. But he's got an incredible sense of humor. He tells this story called Chicken or Duck. And it's about this couple that's walking on the road. And I don't think it's based on an actual couple, but they're walking along on a nice, evening on the road. And all of a sudden, whack, 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 whack. And one of them says, oh, look, it's a duck. And the other goes, no, it's a chicken. And they get into this whole argument about, is it a duck or is it a chicken? And then eventually the person who said correctly that it was a duck goes, oh, no, 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 dear, you're right. It's a chicken. And just like, it's giving the victory to another. I mean, and it's when you're talking about something about whether it's a duck or a chicken, you're not talking about anything that's that consequential, right? No one's life is going to be lost by virtue of whether it's a duck or a chicken. But why engage in behavior that's going to only exacerbate situations rather than things that create the propensity for harmony? As I said, I don't think I can give you the blanket advice simply because it would be you'd have to look at your situation specifically. Who is this person? What patterns of behavior have they shown? Is this really something that will be damaging to them, where they'll start taking advantage of other people, perhaps, and other people who may not like that and who may actually cause more friction with them? You don't want to be sort of encouraging people to do bad things by any means. But in these cases, I think it's perfectly fine to say, okay, I mean, just give them the victory. No big deal. Is anything really lost? And once more, if we lose anything, if by chance even that person says, well, yeah, Anne Marie, you wouldn't believe what she did to me. She finally apologized, but da 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 da. Well, then we may lose our reputation even, but our reputation is also just a worldly matter. It can have an effect on us in terms of our ability to be heard by others or to be trusted by others. And that is one factor of it, but in many cases, it doesn't matter if people in some part of the city are talking poorly about you. Does it really matter? I don't know. I mean, I hear all these perspectives. I'm not in any way saying you're wrong, I'm right. I'm just sharing another way of looking at it. Yes, you are lying in a sense. You are putting forward something that isn't the truth. But you have to, again, and there are cases, certainly in the Buddha's prior life stories and what have you, where he engaged in something that was modified by virtue of his motivation. If your motivation is really to do something good, your intention is good, then what you're saying doesn't necessarily come off as a lie, then. It isn't technically a lie. His Holiness even says that, say you're out in the woods, it's hunting season, and you see a deer go bounding past you. And then you see some hunters that come and they go, where did you see a deer? Where did it go? His Holiness says, you have every responsibility to that being whose life was in danger to lie and to say, no, I didn't see it, or to say, no, it went that way. Now, again, I know that gets into other complications. People have brought this, when I bring this story up, they go, well, what if that person really needs the deer in order to feed their family and da da da, and their family's going to starve if they don't get the. That's overthinking it, if you ask me. I mean, yes, you in the moment you make a decision on the basis of what you're presented with, which is a creature who is being hunted by hunters, who's going to be killed, and you make the decision to save the life of that being. His Holiness didn't have a problem saying that's a lie you should happily engage in. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down this tunnel because I think it can lead to, again, not really getting the gist of what we're mainly focusing on here, which is this relationship we have with others and how do we make sure that we do what we can to enhance that and make sure that there's harmony with others, if it's possible. Some people are not going to be open to that game. They're going to always hold resentment in their heart towards us based on what we did to them. And that's their choice. That's something that even my asking their forgiveness and apologizing might not have any impact on them. But from our own side, it's still a worthy action to contemplate and if we can engage in, if the situation calls for it.
Thank you. I like the chicken and duck story.
I like that one too. Ajahn Brahm is very funny. Yes, Mary Jo.
I would just like to add, I heard of this one person, this is not a Buddhist story, but he helped many people actually by saying to them, I'm sorry for every way in which I have harmed you.
Mm.
And I don't know if it was anyway,
Yeah.
every way.
Yeah.
I think it was, because anyway kind of makes it, oh yeah, well, anyway, I've done it. But it really somehow encompassed that. Please forgive me
Right.
for the ways in which I have harmed you, or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Jo. That reminds me of someone, I think, was it last Thursday? Somebody mentioned me that Venerable Rabina even said that idea. Was that you, Jana? Of like every person that you see on the street, your thoughts might be, please forgive me for any ways that I have harmed you. We've been involved with every single being. If we've had countless lifetimes, according to the Buddha, we've had infinite lifetimes. There's no beginning to our lifetimes. We've been playing bumper cars with everybody, and hitting them, and they've been hitting us, and we've been in this mess for so long. It's nice to kind of hold that thought, oh, you, whoever it is that I see out there, please forgive me for what I might have done to you, And then certainly the things that we know we've done, where we have stepped in it, well, then we have to hold that thought. And if possible, engage in some process with that person. But again, that's not always called for. And it's not always even the best thing that we can do. So does require some deeper investigation. Let me share a little bit with you on apologizing simply because, as I said, I don't think we are taught how to apologize very well at all. In fact, I read this book called On Apology by Aaron Lazar, and it's really quite informative. It's not Buddhist, but it's talking about the fact that we don't really know uh, the proper technique to give an apology. Most of us have learned simply to say, I'm sorry, and think it stops there, and that's good enough. And if the person doesn't accept that, well, so much for them. So, what's the role of apologizing and asking forgiveness of others? Apologizing, in which we admit having done something wrong and then approach the harmed party to ask for their forgiveness, might open the other to forgiveness and reconciliation. But you notice how it says might. We can't take responsibility for how they will respond to that. If we have done something, and again, maybe that's been a thorn in their side for a long, long time, and maybe they're still holding on to the resentment towards us for having done that, they might not be open to forgiving us at that stage. But again, if we feel that it's appropriate, if the timing is there, if all the other factors we're going to talk about are there, it might be good to consider doing that. As with forgiveness, unilateral apologizing, which allows us to let go of feelings of guilt and shame, can be beneficial. So we didn't talk about apologizing in this Jack Kornfield meditation, but there's nothing wrong with doing an extension of that second one, asking forgiveness of others, by actually practicing. You're visualizing the person you offended in front of you, and you're saying, I'd like to apologize for what I did, da 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 da, all the various things. Use that as part of this process of seeking forgiveness of others. They're very tied in. It's not to say that seeking forgiveness of others isn't involved in apologizing, but seeking forgiveness of others doesn't necessitate apologizing. Where I want to really add it in here as another part of the equation that I think is really useful. The benefits of apologizing that are set out, it restores our own inner peace, which allows us to move on. When we do actually, we can do some work on self-forgiveness in terms of, forgiving ourselves. We can do some meditation of seeking forgiveness of others. But if we can actually apologize, it does have a tendency to help you really let go of things. Say, okay, I put it out there. I took onus for this, and I said my piece to another, and I have my own inner peace on the basis of that. It opens up and expands our thought action repertoire. You have an ability to do so much more with the relationship on the basis of you coming forward with an intention to apologize. It overcomes disturbing thoughts and emotions, certainly, helps us to not, or to overcome some of our own tendencies of guilt and what have you, but also perhaps in the other person. Disturbing thoughts that they might have towards us by us now coming forward with a willingness to apologize. It provides the space for reconciliation. Again, doesn't necessarily assure you're going to have reconciliation. And then, as an act of kindness and compassion, it offers the other the opportunity to forgive, thereby restoring their inner peace and allowing them to move on. It is heartening when we see these sorts of things happening in our world, and maybe they've happened with you, where you've had somebody you offended some time ago, and then you have the opportunity to apologize and to be with them in that space, and for things to heal. And those are wonderful. But that shouldn't be our expectation in apologizing. Our expectation is simply that we can put that forward and lift the burden off ourselves to some degree and have the space for that possibility of reconciliation. You may have some instances, certainly, where you apologize, though, and the person may say, well, I accept your apology, but I'd still rather that we not be friends or that we not see each other. And then you say, I respect that. Thank you for accepting my apology, and so on. But you may have cases where people say, I don't accept your apology. What you did was horrible, and I've had to live with that since you did it, or whatever the case might be. That's where they're at in their process. We have to respect that and not force the apology down their throat because they're not ready to go beyond that. And that's okay. That's, again, part of the process. Took a little bit more. Yeah, go ahead. No. Yeah.
Noticed.
I was going to touch on that. That happens sometimes too. If it's been some time, like you go, oh, I'm really sorry for what I did at the cafe that day. And you're like, what did you do? Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Laurel. Because I mean, this is part of the human condition, right? That sometimes we think what we said is so offensive, and then the other person was like water off a duck's back or a chicken's back, depending on which one it was. So let's do a little bit more on this, and then we'll conclude for tonight. The challenges of apologizing or shame and guilt often prevent us from apologizing and moving on. These two are not the positive minds of regret or remorse that we were talking about. Shame and guilt are feeling bad about ourselves, telling ourselves we're a bad person. It may require us to face our own shortcomings and wrongdoings. And I says may require, but it almost always requires us to face kind of the ways in which we have not lived up to our ideals again. We've done things that have harmed others. The third point, it means facing the negative effects of the action on both self and others and seeing the possibility for change. I mean, one of the mind states that can be disastrous for our engaging in these types of practices is if we think we can't change or the other person can't change. Change is always a possibility. I've had stories I've shared with all of you from people that I've heard of that have had amazing change in their lives from behavior that was really quite, heinous, quite horrible. It also, of course, might involve self-forgiveness, that when you're engaging in apologizing, we might have to go through a process of first forgiving ourselves. Yes, please, Earl.
When you said that change is always a possibility, isn't it just as reasonable to say that permanence is never a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, and that permanence being that unchangeability, things not changing. For everything that is conditioned in our world, absolutely. It's impossible for things to stay the same. Change. That reminded me of Louis Richman, who's a Zen practitioner. He was a student of DC Suzuki. Suzuki Roshi once was in a teaching, and he was talking all these concepts around Buddhism, and one person in the audience raised their hand and said, Roshi, you've been saying all these things about Buddhism. I haven't understood a single word. Can you tell me something that I'll understand? And Roshi said, everything changes. Yeah. It's, of course, a source of great pain for people, but it should be a source of great joy for us that everything changes. Because if we were stuck in the same, horrible mental patterns and ways of being that we've been in, well, what luck is there? What use is there? What's the benefit of that? But the fact is we can change. I'll tell you really briefly the story that I've told before about this practitioner and teacher, Vinnie Ferraro. Some of you remember Vinnie Ferraro. He was at a teachers conference that I was at, as a Buddhist teachers conference, and I didn't really hear his story there. I heard it afterwards, and I was quite taken with it. He does have it on his webpage, I believe, at least it was. He used to be in a gang and do a lot of bad behavior in Connecticut in New Haven. He and his buddies would go out and they would beat up homeless people with baseball bats, which is something I'm hope that nobody who's hearing this would ever even think about doing. The Buddha says we've all done that and worse in other lifetimes, so don't think that we're that much better than that. This is the pattern that Vinnie Ferraro got into under the influence of these other people and his own deluded mind. One night he's out there and he's getting ready to beat up this homeless man with his baseball bat. And the man locks eyes with him and says, please don't do this to me. And Vinny says, what makes you think I'm not going to do this to you? And this homeless person says, because you have the most compassionate eyes I've ever seen. And it's like Vinny dropping the bat. He could never pick up anyone again. He heard something from this man that got into that crack in his heart and let the light in, and somehow he was able to transform. He's become a meditation teacher, a Buddhist practitioner. He had this whole St. Paul on the road to Damascus kind of event where suddenly the light was shown and he saw something very different. Well, if there's people like that who are engaging in that type of behavior, who can have a 180 and suddenly they're a different person, we all can change. We're not out there with baseball bats beating up homeless people, I hope. Right?
There's ISIS in our town, I've heard today, and I thought I would like to go to where they are and just see them and not be in the fear.
Right. And again, every one of those beings who's engaged in any type of those sorts of activities or anything we see in our world, they all have the potential to change. Now, whether they will or not, that's a whole nother matter, right? The causes and conditions have to be there for that change to happen. Just like I'm sure some of you saw the film Dead Man Walking about the man who's in prison. Sean Penn played him, and Susan Sarandon played the Catholic nun who went to visit him. And of course, through the process of her meeting with him and talking with him on death row before he gets executed, he came to a very different place. I'm sorry if I'm ruining the ending if you haven't seen it, but this is what happens often. You need a catalyst, you need something to kind of introduce another way of looking at things, another way of being. And if it sticks, then you can have that change happen. But if it doesn't always stick, you know, people again can have some patterns that are pretty ingrained. But that doesn't mean they're permanent, to Earl's point. They're not unchanging and impossible to change. They're just perhaps requiring a bit more energy, a bit more force, a bit more attention to change. And it's not going to be, again, necessarily our personal responsibility to change them. What we're doing in this Mahayana path is to try to become more qualified as a Buddha so we can have better skill and ability to do that. In our current situation, we can barely change ourselves, much less change other people. Our offering to help other people or putting out what we can to have some effect on others is noble, but it's not always going to work. That's really that other person's situation. Let me just go through real quickly. I don't just kind of want to finish off apology to some degree. How do I apologize to others? Remember, apologizing is a process. Like all of these things, like forgiveness is a process. We need to say it's not like, okay, now I can apologize. Now I get that right completely and can do it. The key is a feeling of genuine regret and remorse based on a clear understanding of the negative effects of our actions on both ourselves and others. It's important to identify our motivation for apologizing. You may want to apologize because you really need that person to loan you some money in the future. And if you don't apologize, they're not going to do it. That's not a healthy motivation, right? You need to apologize out of a sincere wish to restore the harmony and balance from your side, at least. Whether that gets restored again is in the other person's court. 4 components of an effective apology. This is again from the book I pointed out earlier. 1, we acknowledge the specific offense and accept responsibility. So we say, Jana, I know I did this, 2 weeks ago, and I take responsibility for having done that. And we can use the words, I'm sorry for having done that, but it shouldn't stop with just, I'm sorry. We show empathy and offer an explanation for why we did what we did, not a justification for why we did what we did, an explanation. Yes, I was in a hurry and I, said something that I shouldn't have, that, that I know is not the right way to treat you or whatever the case might be. It's not again, well, you got me really upset and that's why I said that to you, right? That's making them the object of the negative action. It's saying again why we did what we did. 3, we express remorse, shame, humility, and sincerity in recognizing how the victim suffered. Perhaps even say, I'm sorry that I've caused you this pain and difficulty. If you feel you need to share some of that with me, I'm open to hearing that. Be humble and recognize that we may not even see the extent to which we have harmed others through our actions or our speech. And then the 4th point, which is not always there in an apology, and again, this is an ideal apology or a complete apology, if you will, but even some things we apologize for don't require this. We offer compensation or reparation. We have some way of making good so that the other person detects our sincerity in wanting to heal over that. And of course, we do this with an understanding that that may be what is needed, and we should be willing to engage in that. Yeah, Mary Jo, you were going to share something on that.
Well, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Reparation. It can be something as simple as, I'm sorry that I did this, Jenna, and explaining all that. Can I take you out for dinner sometime, to make up for this or something? It's not necessarily saying, how could I possibly make up for this to you? And then them saying, well, you can give me your house, or you can give me a car. I don't think that that's realistic, and that's not, something that we should maybe feel like we can do. find a way, again, from your own heart and your own side to say, I would like to do something that shows that aspect of it, that shows that I want to repair the relationship. The person may say too here, well, I'm not interested in your reparations because I really don't want anything to do with you, and you're like, okay, I've heard that. I appreciate that and I honor that. Yeah, Earl.
You've said a couple of times now that the other person may decide that they don't want to have anything to do with you.
Right.
Isn't there equally some responsibility to say, this is not going to be a good relationship for me to have in my life, and I need to not be trying to make that interfere with my own practice?
Yes, and we're going to talk about it when it's reversed, when others have done harm to us next week, when we look at the fact that restoring the relationship is not necessarily something we are obligated to do when we forgive others.
Well,
but it's the same here.
yeah,
I agree with you with
the whole thing of
Right.
the feelings of internal shame and unworthiness.
Mhm.
If we're trying to hang out with people that are going to bring us down to feeling like that,
Yeah.
then somewhere we got to have our own boundaries, and
Absolutely.
it's not about
Uh,
we're going to restore this or we're going to turn it into a great relationship.
Exactly.
I got to say, sayonara.
Right. And that can certainly be part of it. If we apologize to another person, but we do recognize that that's not a healthy relationship, that maybe it's going to even cause us to step in it again because of the behaviors and habits that they have, well, then we might say that as part of that and just say, yes, I can apologize for what I did. But I do feel like perhaps our relationship is at a point where we, need to move on. We need to find other ways of, being in the world. And it might be hard for somebody to hear that, but maybe that is what we need to do. Healthy boundaries are not a
It
problem.
could be hard to say it too.
Yes, it can be very hard to say it. But it's a tricky one because once more, I keep wanting to go back to this whole idea, these low John teachings are extraordinary and they're not meant for everybody on the street to practice. But in those cases, you almost want to be around people who push your buttons. There's a story of Lama Atisha, this great master 1,000 years ago. He made the trek from India to Tibet to bring the Buddha Dharma in a stronger way to Tibet. And it said that he brought with him this Bengali tea boy that really pushed his buttons. It really annoyed him. And so, on the whole journey, he had this person with him that he brought along specifically because it helped him work on his own stuff. It sounds a little selfish in some ways, like you make this poor Bengali tea boy do all these negative things to help you out in your own practice. But I mean, this shows the mark of an extremely accomplished practitioner that can be around people who push their buttons, who say things and do things that are negative and not feel any offense, rather deepen their own compassion and patience and what have you. Most of us aren't at that level. So we have to be very skilled in who we allow in and who we, decide we can't be around that person simply because we know it's not good for the level of practice that we're at. If you are one of those advanced practitioners, your Lama Atisha, then you can hang out with those folks and probably do a wonderful job of transforming it into all kinds of wonderful qualities. But for most of us, it's just going to be too challenging.
We can just get married.
Get what?
Get married.
Get married. It's
We
funny.
gotta stick with it.
Stick with it. Make a commitment to be there for perpetuity. Again,
Become a Buddha right away after that?
well, that's part of the process of getting there, but you need more than just that. But every one of us, this is the wisdom side of the path. We have these two aspects that we're trying to practice. We have wisdom and we have compassion. Compassion is informing a lot of the behaviors we're talking about in this course, right? Having compassion for the other person, compassion for ourselves, and wanting things to be as harmonious as possible with all our relationships. But you need the wisdom wing too. You need to recognize that there are some people, and this is why back to the example that Anne Marie shared, where if this is a person who's simply going to take advantage of the fact that Anne Marie's going to fess up to anything, so I'll just keep laying stuff on her and keep engaging in a very unhealthy behavior of making someone feel bad about stuff they didn't even do, right? Well, then that's not very skillful. That requires some wisdom where we say, okay, I'm not going to fess up to this because I know this person is going to take advantage of that and not engage in good behavior. This is the degree to which we can take responsibility for others is not facilitating their bad behavior. Their bad behavior is still their issue they need to work on. We can become more skillful over time, perhaps at imparting some wisdom that will shine some light in there. You know, this homeless person who looked up at Vinnie Ferraro and managed to somehow get through his hard heart, you know, that's pretty amazing. But nonetheless, we do have to take responsibility for not facilitating other people's bad behavior. Right? I mean, I think that's part of how we want to be in the world. Is I don't want to encourage other people to keep telling lies or to keep doing things that are not good for them or for others around them. So if I detach from that because I don't want to be an agent of that, I don't want to be involved in that, that's also a compassionate motivation, not just for ourselves, but also for that person. Because why should we contribute to their bad behavior? Right? I mean,
Because we don't forgive ourselves.
yeah. So we see that one of the best things we can do, not just for ourselves, but for others, is sometimes to detach. We're going to, again, talk about it from the other perspective next week when we look at how, if others have offended us and done things that we need to forgive them for, forgiveness is, they're worthy of that. They deserve that. But reconciliation and restoration of the relationship, maybe not. I mean, look at abusive situations, and perhaps some of you listening to this have been in an abusive situation earlier in your life, perhaps with a parent or a sibling or, you know, some other relative or a friend or whatever the case might be. Is it good to go back into that relationship having forgiven them for what they did? Maybe not, because they may not have moved on from that behavior, right? So we have to be skillful in how we work with all this, and I'll talk more about that next week. We're a little bit over, sorry, folks. I get talking and I forget about the clock. If you have additional questions on this, what I would encourage you to do, first of all, for the next week or so, till we meet next Thursday, is to try to work with this seeking forgiveness of others in a meditation. If you feel compelled after doing the meditation to apologize to somebody, well, then you can work with the skills that we've talked about, but recognize that that may not be a step that you need to take at this point. It's mainly about developing the meditation where you work with that idea of forgiving, asking forgiveness of others. All right, we need the prayer list read first. So where is, I think it's over here. Is that it? Yes, is that it, John? Oh, it's over there. Okay, sorry, I thought I saw something that looked like it. I actually could hand it to Jana, that would be great. I'm gonna turn the camera around so Jana can be on camera.
No, thank you. We dedicate the merit created by listening to this teaching to all sentient beings everywhere on every prayer list. We dedicate for the health and long life of all our precious teachers. We dedicate for all those experiencing obstacles, specifically Wyatt, Amber, the dog, Adrian, Jana, Bodie, the dog, Tony, Mary, Matt, all those experiencing illness, specifically Jane, Lou DeSantis, Jill, Bill, Tilly, the dog, Jana, Carola, Bon Bon, the dog, Tata, the dog, Brian, Euling, Sarah, and Kate. And we dedicate for all those who are dying or who have died in the last 49 days, specifically Bob, Patty, Ed Satterfield, Mice, Helen K, Phil M, Micah the dog, Stony the dog, John B, Akio Yoda-san the dog, Asu the dog, and Stony again.
Okay, were there any other names that anyone wants to add?
Is Bill on here? Or Austin?
Yeah.
Okay, oh, I should keep that there because Dan is gonna, first I said first. Sorry, I didn't put that back on here. Sorry, folks at home here, I'm getting dizzy with all my camera movements here. Let me put on the screen the prayers that Jana will lead us in reciting. A second, there we go, and down one.
Dedication prayers. One time in Tibetan. Gewadi nyo du da la
John Sancho Rinpoche, Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyurchi, Ke Wanyam Pame Paya, Gong Ne Gong Du Pen Sho. Okay, let's go ahead and skip the other prayers that we sometimes do. Just acknowledging we did dedicate for the good health and long lives of our teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as well as all the other teachers with whom we have a karmic connection. And then we also dedicate for the very swift recognition of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation, so we can be blessed with his presence in this world in whatever form that takes going forward for many, many years. And lastly, we just dedicate in general for all the beings in the world to eventually attain the state of complete freedom from suffering and the ultimate bliss of Buddhahood, that ultimate happiness. Okay, thank you all for joining tonight.
Thank you, Dawn.
You're very welcome. Thank you all online.
Thank you. Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Thanks everyone for the good questions and dialogue tonight. I hope it was a bit more of a dialogue. Sometimes I'm just coming out with my stuff, but feel free again if you want to talk to me about any of the questions you had afterwards. I'll hang out here for a little bit. Thanks so much. I'll see you hopefully next Thursday.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks,
Good
Don.
night.
Thanks, Jenna. Bye, Eloise.
Bye. Nice to see
Laura.
you, Mary.